Hello and welcome. If you're studying for the UPSC exams, you've definitely come across fundamental duties. But let's be honest, do you really get the story behind them, their origin, their legal bite, or lack thereof, and why they still matter today? Well, in this explainer, we're going to go way beyond the textbook to give you the insights you really need. Let's dive right in. So here's our game plan. First, we'll set the scene with the controversial history that led to their creation. Yup, during the emergency. Then we'll look at how they were actually added to the Constitution and what they're all about. We're also going to tackle that really tricky question of enforceability. And finally, we'll track their evolution and talk about why they're so significant. To really understand fundamental duties, you can't just read the definition. We have to wind the clock back to a really turbulent time in India's history, the mid-1970s. The whole country was in a state of crisis. What you're seeing here is pretty much the perfect storm of events leading up to the emergency. First, you had the huge economic strain from the 1971 war. Then, that boiled over into massive social unrest, with protests and strikes everywhere. The Sampurna Kranti movement was a huge deal, a major challenge to the government. It was in this incredibly volatile climate that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared a national emergency. And that move, it changed everything. And it's not in exaggeration to call it a constitutional crisis. I mean, fundamental rights were suspended, political opponents were jailed. It was a really dark chapter. Now, it's right in the middle of all this chaos, where the Constitution itself was being reshaped, that the idea of fundamental duties pops up. And that was no accident. The government's argument was, essentially, that citizens had a duty to support the state, and rights couldn't just be absolute. So the government has this idea, this new philosophy. But how do you actually get it into the Constitution? Well, they started building this narrative that rights and responsibilities are, two sides of the same coin. This really set the stage for a brand new chapter in our Constitution, one that would focus entirely on the duties of a citizen. The official line for bringing in fundamental duties was that people were just too focused on their rights. They'd forgotten their responsibilities. The government kept saying that every right has a matching duty. Now, in theory, that sounds perfectly reasonable, right? But bringing it up during the emergency, a lot of people saw it as a pretty cynical move to justify suspending rights and demand obedience. To make this official, to give it that constitutional framework, the government set up the Swaran Singh Committee in 1976. Now, it's important to remember, this committee was made up of members from the ruling party, which of course made people question how impartial it really was. Still, its recommendations are what paved the way for fundamental duties to enter the Constitution. And those recommendations were put into action fast through the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976. This thing was huge. It made so many changes that it's often called the mini-constitution. It's also one of the most controversial amendments ever, mostly because it was passed during the emergency while a lot of the opposition leaders were literally in jail. And here's the result of all that. A whole new part, Part 4A, was added to the Constitution. It had just one article, 51A, which listed 10 brand new fundamental duties. And, as we're about to see, these duties were a mix of moral ideals and civic obligations, and people have been debating them ever since. Okay, so what exactly are these duties? And more importantly, how do they stack up against our fundamental rights, which are, the bedrock of our democracy? Let's break down this whole rights versus responsibilities thing. Okay, this comparison right here is absolutely crucial, especially if you're preparing for exams. Pay close attention. Fundamental rights, they're for all citizens, and some even apply to non-citizens. But fundamental duties? Nope, they are exclusively for citizens of India. But the biggest difference, the one you have to remember, is enforceability. If your fundamental rights are violated, you can go to court. But for fundamental duties, well, it's not that simple. So on paper, the goals of these duties were pretty clear. First, they were meant to be a warning against anti-national activities. Second, a reminder that rights aren't a free-for-all. They come with responsibilities. And third, to encourage a sense of national discipline. But of course, critics argue that these goals are super vague and could easily be used to shut down dissent. All right, let's get to the real heart of the matter. The great paradox of fundamental duties. Can you actually enforce them? This is where things get super interesting, and it's a key area you'll want to have a solid grip on. So let's just ask the question straight up. If you ignore one of these duties, can you get in trouble? Can you be fined or even taken to court? And the simple answer is no. On their own, fundamental duties are what we call non-justiciable or non-enforceable. That means there's no direct legal punishment just for failing to follow them. That's exactly why you'll often hear constitutional experts refer to them as sanctionless duties. It's the perfect term. They are moral and civic obligations, but they don't have any legal penalties or sanctions attached to them directly. But, and this is a huge but, here's the catch. A duty can be made enforceable. How? Well, it's a two-step process. First, Parliament has to pass a specific law related to that duty, and second, that new law has to spell out the penalties for violating it. So the duty itself isn't enforceable, but a law based on it absolutely is. So if these duties are directly enforceable, does that make them useless? Are they just a bunch of nice-sounding ideas with no real impact? Well, not exactly. Over the years, they've actually evolved and have had a real influence on our laws and court judgments. The Supreme Court, in particular, has really given these duties some weight. Take the famous Speed Joe Emanuel case. The court ruled that yes, respecting the national anthem is a duty, but you can't force someone to sing it if it goes against their religious beliefs. It's a perfect example of the court balancing duties with rights. Then you have the MC Mehta case, where the court used the duty to protect the environment to make environmental education compulsory in schools. See, these duties can be used to push for important social goals. But the story doesn't stop with the original 10 duties. In 2002, a new one was added to the list. And this 11th duty is a really fascinating case study in how rights and duties are connected. This all happened with the 86th Amendment Act, and this is just a brilliant example of that right-duty connection. The amendment did two things. First, it introduced Article 21A, creating a new fundamental right to education for kids. And at the exact same time, it added Article 51AK, creating a new fundamental duty for parents to provide that education. So the right of the child became the duty of the parent. Pretty neat, right? And remember that mechanism we talked about, where Parliament makes laws to enforce duties? Here are some concrete examples. The duty to respect national symbols is backed by the Prevention of Insults to National Honor Act. And the duty to protect the environment? That gets its teeth from powerful laws like the Wildlife Protection Act and the Forest Conservation Act. So what's the big takeaway here? Fundamental duties are way more than just a list of suggestions. You can think of them as a moral compass for us as citizens. They're a constant reminder that in a democracy, rights and responsibilities are totally intertwined. You can't really have one without the other. And that leaves us with one final question to think about. Are these duties just symbolic, a relic of a complicated time in our past, or do they actually form the essential moral code that holds our nation together? That's something worth thinking about.